saw this illumination that was moving with respect to the stars. We were smart enough to not say, Houston, there's a light out.
The Apollo 11 mission was one of the most monumental events in the history of mankind.
It could honestly be said that this was the culmination of the dreams and fantasies.
It marked our first foray to the moon, and it also ushered in a new age of development in both science and technology. But ever since mankind first stepped on the moon, the controversies surrounding how we got there and the people involved have never really stopped flowing.
There are videos that look 100% fake.
Sure, you might think that some of these talking points are just crackpot conspiracy theories, but there might be some evidence that the moon, as well as the moon landing itself, might not necessarily be what we think. Now, recent footage has shown that one of the astronauts who was directly involved in the Apollo 11 mission actually spilled some major tea about what they saw up there. In this video, we'll be examining the facts and helping you to better understand one of the great mysteries of our world. Preparing for the space race. For centuries, mankind had admired the moon from afar. We understood this celestial body and its role in helping to keep the Earth where it was, providing gravitational forces and even helping with the ocean's tides. But beyond just seeing it, we humans always wanted to feel it up close. Following the events of World War II, a new rivalry broke out on the global geopolitical stage between the United States and the Soviet Union. The rivalry spread across just about everything: economics, culture, and most especially, military and space. After Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to venture into outer space in 1961, the race was on. And in 1969, the crew of Apollo 11, led by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, did the impossible by docking on the moon. It was a monumental achievement for sure, one that showed that, indeed, humanity was ready to mingle with the stars. And as Armstrong himself called it, this was one small leap for a man and one giant step for humanity. Today, the crew of Apollo 11 are pretty much venerated in schools and culture. And rightfully so. These men took incredible risks and achieved something that no one else had done before them, and even only a few have done after them. However, while Armstrong and Aldrin are the names you mostly hear when it comes to discussions about space travel, there was actually a third man on that crew who doesn't get as much fanfare. Meet Michael Collins. Born in Rome in 1930, Michael Collins was the son of a U.S. military officer. Like his father and older brother, Michael soon found himself in the military, joining the Air Force. And after flying a few missions, he was selected as part of NASA's third group of 14 astronauts in 1963. A few years later, Michael was part of the Apollo 11 mission. While on Apollo 11, Michael's job was to fly the command module while the crew was handling the lunar orbit. After the crew got into orbit, Aldrin and Armstrong detached from the main spacecraft in their lunar module, which was named Eagle. Michael stayed in the main craft, flying it through its command module. On July 12, 1969, the Eagle touched down on the moon's surface, confirming indeed that mankind had gotten to the moon and reached an entirely new frontier. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped foot on the moon, venerating both men in the history books and marking a new beginning for the human race. In total, Armstrong and Aldrin spent about 2 hours on the moon. Their tasks included conducting experiments, collecting samples of moon rocks, and planting the American flag. The astronauts also called President Nixon directly from the moon, with their conversation being beamed for everyone to listen. It was truly a momentous event, no doubt. But where was Michael? Well, ever the soldier, Michael was back, taking one for the team. He could have followed Neil and Buzz to the moon, but he had a job to do, making sure that the spacecraft stayed on course and manning it from the command center. After reuniting with Michael in the main spacecraft, Neil and Armstrong began their journey home. On July 24th, the crew of the Apollo 11 successfully hit splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, bringing their historic journey to an end. The astronauts were met with praise and veneration from people around the globe, but especially in the United States. Their achievement was the culmination of a dream that had lasted centuries, one which many notable scientists and figures had: to reach the moon and be one among the stars, the critical astronaut. Sure, it might not have been overly celebrated or gotten enough fanfare, but Michael's job was incredibly vital. Without him, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would have been lost in space after collecting moon rocks and soil samples. You know those guys who do a lot of work in the background while others take the credit? Yeah, that was Michael. He was the backbone of this entire operation, and without him, one of mankind's greatest achievements would have ended up an unmitigated disaster. That said, it should be noted that Michael did have some accolades as well. As part of the Apollo 11 mission, he was one of only 24 people to fly to the moon. He was the fourth person, and the third American, to perform a spacewalk, and he was actually the first person to have performed more than one spacewalk. Plus, Michael was the second person to orbit the moon alone. Hey, as far as achievements go, that's something for sure. Following his retirement from NASA in 1970, Michael went on to work in the Department of State as the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs. A year later, he was promoted to the director of the National Air and Space Museum. Then he became the Undersecretary of the Smithsonian Institution in 1978. He resigned in 1985, though, starting his own consulting firm, where he transitioned into private practice. Now, when we talk about the Apollo 11 mission, much of the discourse tends to focus on Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. After all, these were the men who actually walked on the moon and got all the adulation. However, there's an interesting fact about the mission that tends to fly under the radar, and that is the part that focuses more on Michael's role. As we said earlier, Armstrong and Aldrin had to detach the Eagle from the main space shuttle when they were about to descend to the moon. This meant that Michael was on his own in the vast expanse of space, while his mates were exploring the moon. Still, this in itself doesn't necessarily encapsulate all that Michael was in charge of doing. You see, Michael wasn't just an idle observer on this mission. Instead, his job was actually quite varied. First, Michael was tasked with ensuring that the main space shuttle maintained its trajectory while Armstrong and Aldrin went on the moon. Unlike these days when space shuttles have autopilot systems that pretty much do most of the work for pilots, things were much more manual back in the day. And this meant that Michael had to be incredibly alert as he focused on handling the course and trajectory of the shuttle. This task entailed making accurate adjustments to the ship's orbit and trajectory, while Michael also focused on keeping constant communication with the command center back on Earth. For this to work, Michael needed to be incredibly sharp, and he needed to be as alert as possible to watch out for any changes that could come. Essentially, Michael was the crucial link that connected the lunar module on the moon's surface with the main command center back on Earth. In his role, Michael operated as the important link between these two sides, sustaining the seamless two-way communication between them and ensuring that everyone was able to remain on the same page. You might think this was just a driver role, but you'd be wrong. In total, Michael spent about 21 hours alone in the command module. While his mates were on the lunar terrain, he had to stay back on his own in the dark expanse of space. It was an experience that would easily have unnerved many people and caused them a lot of mental distress. But as Michael explained, it wasn't so bad. According to Michael, the task of staying on his own was pretty calming. He enjoyed the peace and quiet, and this gave him a lot of time to introspect and consider his own place in the universe. Plus, he was confident that, at the very least, he could maintain proper communication with the command center back on Earth. And if anything went wrong, he could get the help he needed. With this, it was pretty evident that Michael's role was more vital than most people would realize. He might not have set foot on the moon while with the Apollo 11 mission, but without him, this mission would never have been successful in the first place. As Michael himself put it, he was Armstrong and Aldrin's ride back home, and if not for him, our triumphant heroes would definitely not have been able to get back. I mean, good luck calling an Uber when you're millions of miles away from the Earth's surface. The dark side of the moon. Following the completion of the Apollo 11 mission, the advancements that were made in both space exploration and research were mind-boggling. Humans went back to the moon time and again, taking up even more information and learning more about the lunar body. And in 1998, the International Space Station was erected. Still, there's a general sense that none of this would have happened if the Apollo 11 crew had not succeeded on their maiden voyage. At the same time, it's also worth noting that history has shown a very secretive part of space and lunar travel, one that many people tend to gloss over, and one that reveals a very unusual truth about the moon. Until a revelation by Michael before his demise in 2021, no one really knew what these facts were or what their impacts would be. But now some of them are starting to come to light. Now, if you're a space aficionado, you'd realize that the area on the farthest part of the moon is known as its dark side. This side receives sunlight, just like other parts of the moon. But, while there has been a lot of exploration of the moon's nearer side, the dark side tends to be left out. Nevertheless, the dark side of the moon actually has several characteristics that set it apart, and which make it especially interesting. One notable attribute of the dark side is the fact that it is mostly shielded from radio signals that come from and go back to Earth. This is because of the moon's rotational movement relative to that of the Earth. With this unique trait, the dark side of the moon actually functions as an optimal spot for radio astronomy and unobstructed space explorations. There's little to no terrestrial interference here, which means that the region can serve as an optimal location for anyone looking to do any exploration. Photos of the dark side of the moon that have been taken and shared with us also show that the region looks considerably different from the body's nearer side. The dark side appears to have more craters than the nearer side, as well as a much more rugged terrain. We should also note the fact that the South Pole Aitken Basin, one of the most notable impact craters on the moon, is actually located on the dark side as well. This region holds a bunch of topographical significance, offering a window into the formative history of the moon, as well as the forces that shaped it into what it is today. With its geological attributes and ancient impact sites, the dark side of the moon offers a significant amount of invaluable insight into the moon and how it came to be. By studying this region, researchers have been able to learn much more about the cratering process, as well as the general history of both the moon and our solar system as a whole. Many experts also believe that this far side of the moon could be a focal point for future exploration and research, especially into the origins of the moon and its significance to our solar system in general. Already, there are plans to get more information out of this dark side of the moon. A few years ago, NASA instituted the Artemis program, which, amongst other things, aims to better explore the dark side of the moon and examine some of its intricacies. And as humanity's pursuit of lunar exploration continues, the lunar dark side holds a lot of significance for sure. But what about Michael? How does he fit into all of this? Well, according to reports, while waiting for his mates to get back into the main space shuttle, Michael actually slipped into the dark side of the moon. Instantly, communication with the outside world, as well as his command center back on Earth, was cut off, confirming that the dark side of the moon really does cut off all forms of radio signals from and to the Earth. Interestingly, this was one of the first instances of radio silence, a phenomenon where someone is left in a complete state of being unable to communicate with anyone else. He did venture out of the region eventually, and he claimed that he was beyond relieved to be able to once again establish communication lines with his base back at home. As for the dark side of the moon, there have already been some developments with that region and its accessibility. Back in 2019, the China National Space Association launched a program called Chang'e 4 that sent a probe into the dark side of the moon. The space probe here achieved a soft landing within the von Karman crater, which is located in the South Pole Aitken Basin. This marked the first time that a soft landing had been achieved in this region, offering an opportunity for additional exploration of the area. At the same time, the Chinese researchers deployed a U-2 rover on the terrain. The rover's job was to analyze the moon's terrain and composition with the help of onboard scientific devices, as well as look into possible subsurface structures thanks to the work of ground-penetrating radar technology. Back in 2021, it was reported that the U-2 rover actually spotted a mystery object on the horizon while working across the Von Karman crater. The object was a cube-shaped figure located about 260 feet away from the rover, according to a diary published by OurSpace, a Chinese language science outreach channel affiliated with the China National Space Administration. OurSpace referred to the object as a mystery hut, although most people believe this must have been a placeholder name, not necessarily an accurate description of what was actually seen. Experts believe that the figure must have been some form of debris that remained after an impact event that occurred on the dark side of the moon, but so far barely anything has been said about it since then. Who knows what these guys found there? Fake photos, fake rocks? So far, we've spoken about one of the major mysteries of the moon and the experience of Michael Collins in that area. But it would interest you to find out that this isn't the only intriguing thing that has been tied to Michael in the Apollo 11 mission. And for this next one, you might have to hold on to your hats a bit. Back in 2018, Joe Rogan, easily the most popular podcaster in the world, unearthed a very interesting image that really makes you question the entire moon landing and the Apollo 11 mission. On his podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience, Joe had Ben Askren, a notable former mixed martial arts fighter, and the two guys chopped it up about space travel and the moon landing. Primarily, Joe touched on a supposed fake photo of the moon landing that featured Michael. The podcaster showed an image of Michael that was released in his 1974 book, Carrying the Fire. Interestingly, this image can't really be found anywhere else. Nevertheless, many people who have seen the image actually believe that it must have been a fake. The claim here is that Michael isn't actually standing on the moon. Instead, he's standing in a black room with a blurred background that has been modified to look like space. To date, NASA has yet to admit that the picture is fake. Nevertheless, several people have drawn parallels between it and another image that was supposedly taken during a training exercise before the missions. Just that the one supposedly taken in space was more blurred and blacked out. As a side note, some skeptics of this entire moon landing have also pointed out their belief that it would have been impossible for astronauts to actually create footage that was almost as perfect if they were really in space. This is because things like cosmic radiation would most likely have had an effect on the camera film. But what we see here is a picture that seems pretty clear, save for the blurriness, all without any signs of radiation. Of course, it could have been that the astronauts used specially designed cameras to capture content while on the Apollo 11 mission. Still, the fact that no one really knows means that it is pretty difficult to ascertain the veracity or otherwise of these claims. Also, some have called out the fact that this image here shows Michael walking on the moon, but according to most official accounts, he never actually made it to the moon during the Apollo 11 mission. As I said earlier, Michael's job was pretty much to handle the main aircraft and act as the getaway driver, while Armstrong and Aldrin went on to the moon and planted the American flag on its surface. So, what gives? Well, back in 2006, NASA actually did admit that they erased and reused some of the original footage of the moon landing. The agency claimed about 200,000 tapes had been magnetically cleaned and used again as a cost-cutting measure. Eventually, some edited footage and images were re-released in 2009, but while they looked a bit clearer, the fact that everyone knew that they weren't the real thing made them a bit less credible. Still, this isn't even the craziest part, so remember when I explained that the Apollo 11 mission pretty much made the astronauts world famous? Well, I wasn't joking around. Immediately, the astronauts touched down in the Pacific. A full media blitz followed. They traveled to different countries, sharing stories of their heroic mission and their daring feat. As part of this blitz, the astronauts, accompanied by then U.S. Ambassador J. William Middendorf, embarked on a goodwill trip to the Netherlands. There, they met Dutch Prime Minister Willem Dries and presented him with a piece of moon rock. Following Dries's death in 1988, the rock he got from the astronauts was taken to the Dutch National Museum. Well, in 2009, the museum confirmed that what they got was actually not a piece of moon rock. Instead, it was a simple piece of petrified wood. This is the type of stuff you just can't make up, people. Frank Boink, a respected geologist, described the rock as a nondescript, pretty much worthless stone that could absolutely not have been gotten from space. And as you can imagine, this story immediately made the rounds. With his name to clear, Ambassador Middendorf explained that the rock had been given to him by the State Department and that he didn't know much about it. So, he pretty much just punted the blame on the State Department and pulled a shaggy, "It wasn't me." All of this really just makes you want to ask, why on earth would the State Department do this? I mean, the fact that the astronauts even went to the Netherlands was a pretty big deal in and of itself. Why insult the Dutch people with a fake piece of rock? Plus, were the Dutch the only people who got fake rocks? Or were the astronauts just going around handing these worthless stone pieces everywhere they went? Ever since NASA's admission, the people who have always held on to the belief that the moon landing was faked have continued to intensify their calls that there's much more to it than meets the eye. And even if there's nothing to these claims, you've got to admit that this is absolutely not a good look for NASA, or even the astronauts. Outro. The mystery surrounding the moon landing is one that will continue to intrigue everyone. And considering the scale of this event, it's easy to see why. Did Michael really see something on the dark side of the moon? Or was it all staged from the start? Only time will tell. What do you think, though? Let us know in the comments.